So now on to the main content of the introduction, which is an introduction to biophysics. I'm going to go through what is biophysics, and then go through a physicist's attempt to define life, because biophysics really is just trying to gain a different perspective, a physical perspective into biology or biological systems. So we'll start off with a quote from Albert Einstein in 1950. So obviously Albert Einstein is one of the most famous theoretical physicists in history. One of the quotes, or two of the quotes that he had, related to defining science and physics. So he defines science as science is the attempt to make the chaotic diversity of our sense experience correspond to a logically uniform system of thought. In this system, single experience must be correlated with the theoretical structure in such a way that the resulting coordination is unique and convincing. So it might take a few moments to absorb fully what he means by that, but I take it to mean that he thinks that science represents the activity of being able to correlate an experimental observation with a theory or a structure that would logically make sense. So if you can mathematically prove something or model something and show that it works and have those results match experimental data, then that is the goal of science. Now then he further described physics as what we call physics comprises that group of natural sciences which base their concepts on measurements and whose concepts and propositions lend themselves to mathematical formulation. So here, what this means is that Einstein thinks that any activity that has experimental measurements that correlates well with any mathematically formulated theory is a physical or physics-based study in nature. So that really leads us to defining what biophysics is. Is it a subset of biology or is it a subset of physics? So from Einstein, it seems like he would have thought that biophysics would have been a subset of physics. So we'll try and take a look at that. So first of all, if we can use a mathematical foundation to explain and prove a well-documented phenomenon, then that is considered a physics-based study. So that is traditionally what is known as physics. So now we're going to take a look at physics versus biology. Physics is based on measurements, theoretical models, and mathematical formulations. So in this case, we have an entire universe that consists of just matter and just energy, and they are in non-stop motion. So they can interact with each other, they cannot interact with each other, so on. But there's just matter and there's just energy. What physics studies are based on are that structures and properties of matter are going to be universal, and that's a key word. So matter is made up of, in terms of universal, it just means everything is made up of the same thing. So you have matter is made up of fundamental particles. You've got electrons, protons, and neutrons. You've got matter that's formed by the same set of chemical elements. That's also universal. You also have motion that's caused by fundamental interactions like gravitational, electromagnetic, and nuclear interactions. So if you take a look at all of these different things, you'll notice that everything is fundamental. In physics, you break down something large into its fundamental components to try and understand it. So matter behaves the same, in this sense, it says that matter is going to behave the same way under the same conditions. So then through physics, we can describe these different phenomena using physical theories and laws. With biology, it is totally different. So coming from a biology background, I know that nothing is absolute and everything is always evolving. So living organisms are way more complex than inanimate objects like the computer I'm looking at right now. I am definitely way more complex, and everything is dependent upon space-time. So I might be different in a different time. I can age and in different space, in a different location, the conditions are going to be different, and my body is going to adapt to different environments. So in a living system, we're constantly adapting, we're constantly evolving through space and through time, and that is a main difference between the studies for physics and biology. So now we have to find a way to merge the two fields together. So keep in mind what I said before. In physics, one studies complex systems by breaking them down into simpler subsystems. So then what you do is analyze the individual simple subsystem, try to understand it, make sure it correlates with experimental observations, and then you build up, add more layers of complexity so that you get to the bigger picture and eventually to the complex system. So if we use that perspective of physics and apply it to biology, then we can just ask ourselves, what are living systems made of? So we're going to break down living systems, and the first thing that most people think of is that living systems are going to be broken down into cells. So many physics-based studies in the past have investigated cellular structure and properties, and that's how a physicist would start approaching these biological systems and problems. But then later on, you'll note that cells aren't small enough. Cells are made of many more things. They can further be broken down into molecules and then eventually atoms. So if we take a look at molecules, then we can study molecular interactions, we can study intermolecular forces, you can study self-assembly, and so many more things. So that is why there's an entire subset of biophysics called cellular and molecular biophysics, because that's where all of the physical-based studies start, so that we can understand the bigger picture. So now we go back to the question of what is biophysics. Biophysics is defined as a field of science that applies theories and methods of physics to understanding how biological systems work. So based on Einstein's explanation of what physics is, it's clear that biophysics is not a subsidiary branch of biology, like physiology. That would actually require us to use biological laws and methods to study physics. What it is, though, is a subsidiary of physics, just like astrophysics. In astrophysics, you're using physical theories and laws and applying it to space studies in space. So in biophysics, it means that we are going to use physics-based theories, laws, and methods to study a special class of systems, and those would be living biological systems. And to be honest, it really just has to do with how we approach a problem. If we see something complex, we model it as something simpler, we make sure that model works, and then we add more layers of complexity to it so that we can use physics to explain something new. So how do we start breaking down a living system? So the question is breaking down life. So, we don't want to ask what is life, because I don't even know what that is. We're going to rephrase it and ask what characterizes a living organism? What sets us apart from something that's non-living? So we have to think of it from a physical perspective as well. How are we different? Not just because something's moving and something's not, or something's breathing, and an inanimate object isn't, but at its core, a living organism should exhibit these three main characteristics from physics. So number one, it's an open system. That means it's constantly interacting with its environment, and it exchanges both matter and energy with its surroundings. It's also self-regulating. So that means it's capable of extracting and transforming energy to build and maintain its own interactions, its own intricate structure and function. It's also capable of self-reproduction. So living organisms can organize well-ordered structures spontaneously from heterogeneous matter and produce copies of themselves. So with those three things listed as requirements for a living organism, now we can think of how physics ties in to try and prove each of these. So the condition of life, one of them, is an open system. So that means it interacts with and exchanges matter and energy with its environment for survival. So what kind of physics concept can best explain this mechanism for survival? In open systems, with the interaction of matter and energy with its surroundings, we're looking at thermodynamics, which is a topic that we'll cover in this course. According to the second law of thermodynamics, all isolated processes are going to tend towards a higher state of entropy or disorder. So if we think about it, living systems are basically a collection of different processes of life, especially the aging process. So if I keep going through all these cellular processes in my body and tending towards a higher state of disorder and entropy, it means that I will tend towards a state of total disorder, which might possibly mean death. So this seems morbid and it seems too fast, and it can't be, because living systems do persist and they exist. So that means there has to be something else to help explain how we can survive if all of our systems tend towards a state of disorder. In order to maintain a highly ordered state and be one, like I am right here, it means I have to be able to offset all of the increase in entropy that I'm creating from my body's processes. So I have to feed upon negative entropy by interacting with my surroundings. So by using thermodynamics, we now gain a different perspective into why a living organism is an open system. Through thermodynamics, we know that we have to grab some negative entropy from our surroundings in order to maintain some balance in our bodies. And this shows that we have to interact with and exchange matter and energy with our surroundings in order to survive. Now, life condition number 2, self-regulation. A living organism is self-regulating. It's like a machine that is built according to a design for a specific purpose. So in terms of how we can use physics to explain this creation, we turn to molecular biophysics. So you probably know that Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA back in the 1950s and shared the Nobel Prize for this discovery along with Maurice Wilkins in 1962. Crick and Wilkins were both physicists to begin with, and they turned into biophysicists. They actually leveraged the use of X-ray crystallography, which is rooted in a physical method, to allow for the structural study of molecules. So even back then, this was a biophysical study because it combined knowledge of physical tools to study something of biological significance. So molecular biophysics would be the physical topic or concept that was used to explain how living organisms can be self-regulating through DNA, the coding pattern, and the entire mechanism of transferring codons during the synthesis of proteins, as well as DNA replication. Now, the third condition is self-reproduction. So the idea of self-reproduction is that we can actually organize well-ordered structures spontaneously and produce copies of them. So this seems like there's a lot of chaos occurring, and yet with all this chaos, we're creating some sort of order. So we call this order out of chaos. Then we turn to thermodynamics and self-assembly. We have to remember that living systems are open systems, and they can be found in two different types of states. Because all living organisms are in open systems, it means that we can be in an equilibrium state or a steady state, and we can also be in an unsteady or non-equilibrium state. So with the first condition of life, where things were in equilibrium and we interacted with matter and energy uniformly, we now look at non-equilibrium states. So what happens if we interact too much? If we have too much energy, what happens then? If we have an unstable system, what happens is that we might be able to attain new dynamic orders where you have a collection of particles that will assemble together in a coherent manner, just because all of the ones that are in that same state will group together. So think of this like a phase transition for a lipid at different temperatures. Now, what also can happen is if you have a continuous flow of energy and matter from your surroundings, you'll be able to generate ordered structures from chaotic mixtures of simpler molecules. So there are two different types of non-equilibrium states you can have. One where you have phase transitions from unstable systems spurring on self-assembly, or you can have continuous flow of energy and matter into the system so that it surpasses some sort of threshold and forms ordered structures. So back to the main question, what is biophysics? Biophysics is an interdisciplinary science. It applies physics-based approaches and methods to study biological phenomena. It also covers all the scales of biological organization, from small molecules to biospheres and populations. So, like I said, we start small and you get big. And what is the significance? So, physicists can use math to explain what happens in nature. Biologists can understand how biological systems work through the use of physical tools. So if you combine the two types together, what you can do is now tackle questions such as how nerve cells communicate with each other, what kind of signals can we get from these, from signal transduction, how plant cells can capture light and transform it into energy, and how we can quantify this energy, how changes in DNA can trigger transformation of normal cells to cancer cells, and so on and so forth. So there are tons of applications that we can look at, from research and medical diagnostics like MRIs to bioengineering and complex computer modelings of living systems. So just as a summary, what you should remember, it's not much for the first lecture. You should remember which platforms to use for this course: Learn, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, and Discord. You should remember what is due every week and what each component is worth. You should understand where you can find support for this course. And last but not least, understand what biophysics is and how we can use a physical perspective to try and understand a biological phenomenon.